So we've got a really esteemed panel, and we'll go through the introductions in a moment. But what I want to say to the panel is that while we may be convinced that big data is important, what we need to do is convince everybody here that it's important. So I want all the panelists to think about what are the positives of the partnership, what have been the successes, what are the opportunities, and potentially what are the pitfalls of big data. So they're the things as we walk through. We are safe here. There's a lot of so they're the things really think about when we're framing our response. So I'll start down the end with David, and I'm going to keep it informal. I won't use.
Sorry, if you click on your name, it'll bring up the background slide.
Okay.
This is sport, Queensland sport, so what's tonight? So I don't know if that's today.
All right, that's an old.
It's a drama.
Let's start with, and I'm going to keep it informal. I won't use titles and use first names just to get the discussion flowing. So, David, would you like to just tell us who you are, just what your role has been?
David Theile. I had a long career as a surgeon originally, and subsequently as a health administrator, as CEO of PA Hospital, and then CEO of Metro South, then been the clinical advisor to TRI, and I have been involved with you hearing me? And then I have been involved with the partnership for 5 years, something like that. No, it's less than that.
Longer than that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I was in the subcommittee, colorectal subcommittee before that. So I have a long-term view of the whole process that has developed, and I've watched it develop. I think it's a fascinating story.
Thank you, David. Is it Hazel?
Hazel, yeah.
Hazel,
Hi.
You want to just tell us your role?
Yeah, sure. My name is Hazel Harden. I've been involved with the partnership since 2004. So a long journey, and so my background is clinician researcher, cancer data, and that changed in 2018 when my son was diagnosed with cancer. So I'm the consumer rep on the partnership, and I have the privilege of being able to look at big data from both sides of the coin, really.
Penny Mackenzie, radiation oncologist. I've been involved for the last couple of years in the partnership, and then more recently with the radiation oncology subcommittee. So yeah, I feel very grateful and privileged to be part of such a great team. And thank you, David and Shoni, for your fabulous leadership. And thank you for the opportunity to be involved today.
Thank you. Joanne?
Thanks, Sandro. My name is Joanne Aitken. I'm Head of Research at the Cancer Council of Queensland and President of the International Association of Cancer Registries, and on top of all of that, I'm a cancer epidemiologist, so big data is what I do. I'm already convinced, and my wish, I suppose, is that we convince, as Sandro has said, everybody of the benefits of big data. I think that there is coming in the future, perhaps we'll move towards the way that Europe has gone, which is more restrictive of data, and we need to be on guard and educate the community. And I think that the way the partnership has handled the data ethically and with full consideration for privacy really sets a great example for how we can go forward with this. But it's coming, and we really need to guard against the inability to access big data.
Okay, thank you. John?
John Bashford. I'm a clinical hematologist by trade. My present role is as Director of Research for Aitken Cancer Care, and I've been in practice at the Wesley for over 30 years. Now stepped down from clinical practice, but I was previously Director of Bone Marrow Transplantation over there. I see my role in this project as having been a go-between between a large private sector group and the partnership, and I've certainly been very supportive of being able to enable that link to enable private data to be prominently part of this project, and it's a project that I'd like to see continue, because I think, as has already already mentioned in the leading talks, the ability to link in the private sector where there's approximately 50% of the chemotherapy and a very significant proportion of the radiotherapy done. It's critical that we play a part in this project so that the data reflects all of Queensland. I just say, Sandro, that I'm proud to be a Queenslander. I'm pleased that you've picked that up down there in Victoria, because it really is a great project, this one, and we've led the way.
Streets ahead. Peter?
Peter Steadman, I'm an orthopaedic surgeon. My cancer journey started in 1998.
Is that an apology or is that
Could be. When I had a Queensland Cancer Fund fellowship, and I went to the Mayo Clinic, and I've been providing sarcoma surgical services in Queensland now since 1997, I think. I'm on the board of the Australian New Zealand Sarcoma Association, and I'm the president-elect of the International Society of Limb Salvage, which is the World Orthopaedic Sarcoma body. So thank you very much. One thing to say is that I'm only a relatively recent entry to the partnership. Sarcoma as a rare disease is often sort of thought of as last. So I guess I've got some insights about joining just in the last 12 months, and as we tease through the process of sort of the last 20 years of information and the constant evolution of diagnoses and treatments and various things, it's quite challenging. So thank you.
Excellent, Peter. We might come back and touch upon that with rare cancers, because they collectively account for a third of all cancers and about a third of deaths. So if there ever a good reason to collect data or big data would be rare cancers. Euan?
Euan Walpole, I'm a medical oncologist. Like Hazel said, this has been a long journey for me. This started with the conversation with Hazel, Shoni and myself in 2004, and we've been going ever since through various iterations of it, which is really to try and see if you can get data of quality enough to understand what actually happens to patients in Queensland rather than how many people get cancer and how many die.
Thank you. And Lindy, we haven't met. Hello.
Hi, I'm Lindy Jeffree. I'm a neurosurgeon. I've been using COOL for the MDTs and for research data for about 10 years. And then for my sins, I'm leading a national drive to try and set up an Australian brain cancer registry. We performed a feasibility and scoping study and identified that nobody does it better than Queensland. There is nothing better than COOL, and so that's what we want to use for our registry, at which point I joined the partnership to ensure the quality of their data.
Shoni? We all know Shoni.
Yeah, you all know me. I'm Shoni, so I'm Hazel and Euan. I've had a long involvement with the whole program of work, which started out as QCAT and is now moved to Cancer Conference Queensland. We took baby steps in the early days. We then toggled for a little while. We became a teenager and we had a bit of angst dealing with trying to get a program like this up and running, but I think we've matured really nicely. And so it's been a real privilege to work with this great bunch of people.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Shoni. So what we'll do is I will direct some questions specifically to some of our panellists, and then others will be just open for anyone to jump in. There's only one mic, so I think the best thing would be just to sort of speak up. Trying to hand the conch down will be challenging. And of course, if there's any questions, then raise your hand.
That's right.
So I think the thing that we should start with perhaps is about the governance of the partnership, and fairly succinct, and maybe one of the current chair or the former chair might like to answer that, just about the governance around the partnership.
Me?
Euan, why don't you kick off?
So the governance, part of this is a functional element of Queensland Health, which happens to with PA and me. But the thing that actually has made this possible is, strangely enough, legislation in Queensland. There is the Act which allows quality assurance committees to occur, which can be gazetted, but it allows you to access privileged information, to access the quality of services of health in Queensland, and therefore you can do lots of things which other states can't do. So it allows us to share, like with John and the private sector, so that they can feel comfortable that this is a legally acceptable behaviour that you can do without informed consent. So this provides a lot of value, and as Joe talked about, the thing that we've got to be certain about, we've got this privileged information, is you cannot share identified information with others. De-identified, yes, but how you actually manage that challenge And then we have the challenge of how then we share that with the Commonwealth to get them to play, because that's a different lot of rules. But I think that has made it possible. I think we would struggle without that overlaying umbrella.
Yeah, so that's an enormous advantage, isn't it? So, any questions around the governance of the partnership? So, the thing that the clinician always asks is, well, how do we verify the quality and the veracity of the data that's going in? Shoni, I might ask you to sort of address that question.
Thanks, Sandro. Yeah. It is a question we get asked a lot, and I think what we did in the early days, which has really reaped rewards, is that we spent a lot of time working with clinical teams and also doing old-fashioned sharp audits as comparisons to demonstrate and prove that the data was robust and rigorous and could be relied on. We also then put the data in front of any number of clinicians and clinical teams, so then have a look at it and get their hands dirty. And there's nothing better than 15 sets of eyes examining something and really questioning particular result or other things. So that's done a lot of favours over the years, and I think we've moved on actually quite a lot since then, and we rarely get asked that question anymore.
Yeah. Joanne, tell us, how do we use real world data, or how does an epidemiologist use real world data? Because that's what this is, it's unselected, non-clinically, tight eligibility for clinical trials. So how do we use real world data?
I think that the rapid fire presentations we've had this afternoon explain better than I can how we use real world data. It's exactly like that. And the critical thing is that it is, I like that name, real world data or big data. What we mean is data across the whole population, not selected subgroups within clinical trials or selected subgroups who are private or public, but across the whole population. So I think that question is as you saw this afternoon, and you can see the power of that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? So, Lindy, your area is really considered probably a rare cancer, brain tumours. How do you see the linkage between the data that Queensland has and your tissue bank?
That's something we're still exploring. One of my dreams and part of the drive to set up a national brain cancer registry is to get clinical annotation of the banked tissue from the registry data, or from the automatically collected data. That's not something we've actually achieved yet, but we're hoping that we can test pilot that so that we have the identifying data from the tissue in the bank, and then we can find out how long they lived, whether they had radiation, maybe whether they had chemotherapy, and annotate the collected specimens with that.
Right. Now, Hazel, did you want to, because you have an interest in genomics?
And the genomics.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you want to just tell us about your initiative, Shoni, and share that with us?
One of the frustrations being a parent of a young person with cancer, you soon realise that outcomes for so many young people are really poor. And we've got to look at ways to, what I think, accelerate scientific discovery, because it's frustratingly slow. The outcomes for many haven't changed for so many years. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. And I think one of the ways is to use a resource, a big data resource like this, and really open it up to anyone who is interested in doing research in this space, and making it easy for people to access this data. And then the other aspect of it is to actually strengthen the data, so we actually get a much better understanding of the cancer that we're dealing with, and that's where genomics comes in. And so genomics shouldn't really be, if we are going to make a dent in this and accelerate scientific discovery, genomics shouldn't be an afterthought. It shouldn't be done as part of the clinical trial and research. It should actually be done up front and used to inform our understanding of what we are dealing with, as close to diagnosis as we possibly can.
Thank you, Hazel. So, anyone from the panel, how will we, so we haven't typically collected genomics data as part of sort of Queensland's big database. How are we going to do that? That's open to anyone, Euan or Shoni.
Right. Do you want to?
But one of the problems is how do you actually collect such data, which is very complicated, which I think is a learning phase which we have to go through, which we're trying to do at the moment. You know, ideally you'd like to see as part of registry that the genomic information was collected with everything else. That will be possible when the new regulations for cancer registries go through Parliament, hopefully this coming month. The trouble is, how do you store it? What's it look like? It's complicated moving feast, which is something I think is work for the future, but hopefully near future rather than long-term future.
Shoni, did you want to add, or Hazel?
Yeah, do you mind if can I add to that? I mean, our passion is to offer it to upfront, just as part of clinical care. And we've actually got a pilot, well, a demonstration project happening at PA Hospital at the moment with young people with cancer. So, unfortunately, obviously, genomics isn't funded, so we are finding ways to raise the money so that we can offer young people the sequencing. And we consent them up front. So we ask them up front in a really kind of young person friendly way whether they want to have their genome sequenced and whether they then want to donate their information to the library. And we're testing that process basically. And that's how I think we can really get traction with genomics. It has to be done up front. People have to be asked. And people, if it's explained properly to them, are quite capable of kind of making these informed decisions. And I think what's kind of underestimated is when, for example, you have a child with cancer, the drive to prevent this happening to someone else is incredibly strong. And there is no point in holding on to your information. So,
thank you. I'm going to ask, so Peter Steadman, you mentioned you've just joined the group, and so what I'd like to get from you is what were your perceptions before about the Queensland Big Data or the Cancer Alliance Queensland, and now that you're in the partnership, in the organisation, you know, how are your perceptions and reality sort of, are they matched or are they distorted?
Sure, thank you very much, Sandro. So the first thing is orthopaedic surgeons have been collecting big data for a long time. One of the big prizes of the Australian government run by the Orthopaedic Association is the National Joint Registry. So every joint replacement that's gone in Australia for the last 20 years has been collected and, you know, right across the country and uniformly in terms of things that are going in and outcomes. And so we've been able to sort of go back and analyse results. And so if I think about that concept and I think about the biological concept of cancer, in Queensland, as I said, it's a rare cancer, and we've had a sort of small service. You know, there's basically, for many years, there were 2 surgeons, and now it's expanded to 4 surgeons who are orthopaedic surgeons who do orthopaedic sarcoma work. But there's a small general surgical cohort. There are what we call the whoops operations that are done out there by other doctors who just inadvertently find themselves operating on things that they either shouldn't have been or weren't expecting to be. There are neurosurgeons who sort of operate on things in the spine but have a different sort of approach.
It's not a political statement.
No, this is not a criticism. I'm just sort of talking about what the field looks like. And so that data, if you like, or those diagnoses and various things, they've not all been coalesced into one space. That I guess is my point. And so the beauty of what the Alliance is doing is that it's drawing upon multiple different sources. And as we know, cancer is a statistical disease. And so as Dr. Bashford's pointing out, half the population is insured and half aren't. So that means that on any one day, you're going to have only 1 or 2 people turn up at the public hospital and the other 1 or 2 turn up in private, and the treatment process is very different. And as I say, we tried to collect data personally as surgeons, but that's not really been complete. So having arrived, now's the opportunity to go back and look at all that data and, you know, clean it. And as Shoni said, there's a lot of cleaning to do, and clinical input and just bringing things into a sort of sensible shape. And strange enough, we've got data going back 30 years, but because of the evolving names of diseases and the WHO changing names of different types of tumours and various things, actually quite a challenge really to bring all that together.
Great, thank you.
Can I
Please go ahead.
Something you touched on here, which is one of the things that I think is really important about what Cancer Alliance Queensland does is systematically collect data from everybody. Because if you just collect data from specialists who have a particular interest in a particular disease, they're going to be better than average. And it doesn't give you a record of what's happening to the rest of the population. And so we need to be collecting data from the OOPS operations and from the surgeons who are spine surgeons but think because they're a neurosurgeon they can do brain tumours too, and they do one a year, and all those other people, to check that their outcomes are as good as everyone else's, and if they're not, to discourage them from doing those operations.
Thank you. So I'm coming to you, Penny, in a second, but I'm going to just ask John a question. John, you're in that unique position where you've been involved in lots of research in the private sector versus the public. How do you see the private engaging with the partnership? Do you think it's a successful relationship? Do you think there are strengths from the private versus the public?
Yeah, look, thanks, Sandro. I think the first comment I'd make is I've always viewed this project from a consumer view, and maybe it's being in private practice, you tend to be thinking, what are your consumers wanting, and how do you best achieve that? And ultimately, I think, as has been said, people want to know that they're getting quality therapy, and that's a very difficult thing traditionally, really to go in down what are outcomes. Are they the same in public versus private, North Queensland versus South Queensland, country versus city? And there's many held beliefs and prejudices in all directions around those things, and I think the beauty of this project is it's able to address that, and I think for consumers it provides powerful information to assist, and certainly as clinicians it allows us to hopefully structure things better so that we get more uniform outcomes across various sectors. I think in the private sector, one of the issues is that there are still significant gaps, and I think if you're in the cancer care space, you ought to be in this space as well, but there are gaps, and I think perhaps part of the way forward is to fill in those gaps, because there are individual practitioners in some settings, there are different hospital groups, so I don't think that's quite conquered at this point, but I think the success so far, what we're seeing, really justifies that broadening.
So I want to turn to Penny and talk about a couple of the successes that partnership has had. So Penny, you were involved with the palliative radiotherapy. You wanted to sort of reflect on the outcomes of that before, what it means from a radiation oncology perspective.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, as clinicians, or all clinicians in the room, we all want to provide the best possible care to our patients. And the palliative radiotherapy document produced by the Cancer Alliance is one such tool we can use to review our practice. We know that palliative radiotherapy is an important treatment for patients, but we also need to select those patients appropriately for treatment. Palliative radiotherapy can be used for treatment for metastatic disease or for patients with local regional disease and not suitable for curative intent treatment. However, this document addresses the issue of radiotherapy at the end of the life and the appropriate selection of patients and the appropriate number of treatment or fractions for the patient. So this was a document sent out to all departments and all doctors involved in the care, so they're able to review their practice and recommendations. Correct, and recommendations were made for the clinicians and how to review the document and implement it in their day-to-day practice.
It's a good sort of success from the partnership. And another one was the timing of breast cancer treatment.
I think we have the expert in the room, Michelle Morris. Michelle, would you like to comment?
Do you want to make a comment?
Sorry, Michelle.
On the breast cancer, it's the timing of the timing.
I guess highlights where our gaps are in services and where we may be falling down, to be able to see the impact on the outcome and survival of our patients and what are the factors that are driving that is a potentially huge impetus that change in patient quality and improvement. That's what we hope to come out of it.
David, so you've been with the partnership for about 5 years, 6 years, a little bit longer. Seems longer. What's that?
It might be slightly more, but
Yeah.
yeah,
Do you
something
want
like
to share with us maybe some of the changes that you've seen in the program itself? You know, it's obviously an evolving beast, and way we'll be collecting data in 10 years will be different. And we've already talked about, you know, things like linking genomics and how we do that. Do you want to sort of perhaps share with us some of the observations you have made in terms of what's changed and where you think we might be going?
Yes, well, I'll come at that from two lines. Firstly, the changes that I've seen in quality surveillance in the time that I've been in practice, and it's grown from being based on the personal professionalism of the clinical deliverers, and then unit reviews have developed, focal audits, and some of those have been overseen by the professional bodies, College of Surgeons, College of Physicians and so forth, but they've all been relatively focal. I guess the first general things that have came in were Health Round Table, but it used its parameters mostly as cost of care, lengths of stay, and then focal assessments of adverse outcomes. They came in strongly some 20 years ago, and they've been classified and invited the attention of administrators when there was an adverse event, but all of those are very focal. What we've come to now is looking at the surveillance of quality in a much broader fashion. It's not just about mortality or adverse events, it's about the overall performance, and we're doing that for cancer very well. The system that's enabled that to happen has, in Cancer Alliance Queensland, the systems there are applicable to other diagnoses, which that's the future perhaps. So that's one line of that I've observed, and the other line is the way in which the Cancer Alliance Queensland has been built. It's been built from a hard core of endeavour by Euan, Shoni, Hazel, and attaching to that progressively collaborations. Fairly quickly there was the partnership, which was the clinical collaboration, but it's expanded now to where the collaborations are on the basis of capabilities. New capabilities have been partnered with using artificial intelligence with the CSIRO. There have been collaborations nationally, and they could be elaborated on more precisely by others, probably Shoni. There are the collaborations between the public and private sector, and the way in which the private sector has been drawn into the collaboration, and Aitken have actually been probably the leaders in that collaboration, or the pathology firms generally, they have come on board fairly thoroughly, so building by collaborations, and there are more to go on with if you wish, but that's the exemplary thing about the building of Cancer Alliance Queensland.
Excellent. Does anyone have any questions for the panelists? Yeah.
I guess we've come a long way in getting huge amount of robust data and showing, demonstrating quality of care where we fall down. I guess the next step is then transforming change to try and improve the quality of the outcomes. What's
to do it now. So, two things there. One is that question, and then also, where does the alliance stop? Where's your responsibility, and then sort of how do we implement change basically?
So I think that's probably been the big question for 20 years, though, and it's about how you can influence change and what you can do. We have worked on the principle that providing clinicians with good data will lead them to change because they believe they all believe they're doing the best thing. But if you can show them they're not, they often will change behaviour. We've seen that with surgery consolidating to larger sites, so less often. So it does happen. We've tried to avoid using Queensland Health because of the big stick approach, but I think at the moment we're still struggling with some of the things. The breast cancer data is interesting because it shows that public patients in Queensland wait longer for other treatments. There is worsening survival because of the waits, and how can we use that? So it's trying not to get a thou shall not divine rule from above, and how do you balance that about how health systems work? The private sector does a good job in this space, but it's the public sector we've got to try and somehow help along. And to me, the only way that will ever do that is if there's some sort of indicator they've got to actually follow, because our health services are driven by indicators, which is time for this, time for that, time for something, but none of them have got anything to do with cancer. So we see patients who are suffering from serial delays. So we need a better way of doing that. So the new Australian Cancer Plan I've tried to influence because there's some issues within that, because that's about equity of access. And one of the reasons you can't influence the company unless you can measure it. So we've got to measure it first, and then you've got to come up with some robust ways of trying to look for those things that will affect change. And I don't think we know them all at the moment. We think we can measure some things. New South Wales, Victoria thinks they can measure some of those things or most of those things. Trouble is South Australia and WA can't measure any of those things. So it's going to be difficult to work how we do this as a country. But in Queensland, we're going to probably ask for lots of your support to try and convince government here that we need to lead the way and show it that can be done, and we've got to measure something that's useful. And it would be useful to use people like John to have the private sector, public sector pushing to government to do something. Some sort of cancer KPIs, which aren't things that are going to be onerous, that's not going to kill services into measuring things that we believe in somehow. And how do we control that? That's the other problem, because politicians will end up with you will do the following. So we've got to find some happy medium. So please advise us.
Can I just add to that? Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Sorry. I was just going to say, Michelle, I think we're really quite undeveloped and unsophisticated in how we use consumers as allies to try and get the system change that you're looking for. Typically it's a kind of a courier mail exercise. That doesn't work for anyone. There are countries overseas like the UK, they see their consumers as participants. They select them for skills, experience broader than the fact that they've had a particular disease. So I think we could get a lot better with that in Queensland, given the resource that we've got available.
Thank you. Peter, just before you answer, Damien, I'm putting you on the spot. I know you're not expecting you sitting in the back of the room there, but you represent a foundation that is built on consumers. How can a foundation help influence government? Is there any role for a foundation to given the large collective group of consumers you have? I know you sort of mainly deal with things where there's a clinical trial and where you're asking money from you.
I think the thing that we've really worked hard over the last years is to really recognise as a foundation, a place where primarily people receive money. We've actually seen that there's a real emotional connection to the people who give money. The people who give money, whether it's $5 or $1,000, are the ones most emotively connected to do something. That's their way of doing something. And actually,
resonate with you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's about being skillful about it, because we've all got emotive stories to tell. Is channeling them in the right direction and through the right forums. Otherwise, we quite easily get branded as troublemakers, and that's not our intention. Yeah. So I think we do have to think carefully about and strategically about how we're going to mobilise our consumers, the people in our community, to get the change happening that we want to see happening, and engage them at a systemic level.
So did you?
Yes, I just wanted to address Peter and I agreed he'll have the next turn.
Collaboration.
So there's a first and surgeon leading a medical oncologist.
That's a worry. Yeah, indeed. So I just reiterate the consumer comments because in my experience in professional medical politics, every campaign is won by consumer involvement. We as clinicians can provide data, we can provide advice, but 2007, the 24-hour news cycle was said to be a scourge for politicians. Now it's the 1-hour news cycle, and so their attention spans are very short, and they really listen to consumers. I think first and foremost, they then come to us for advice. Is this right? And then you've got to have data to prove it. And I think the Rare Cancers Australia group are a very good example of a consumer group coming back to clinicians, getting data, taking it back and getting good outcomes. But it's so that's the role that we're playing, to put that data, have that data, and to believe in it, curate it and believe in it. But ultimately, it's the consumer partnerships that will win the sorts of changes that Michelle's talking about. So, ultimately, our goal.
Thank you, Peter.
Finally, he's given the microphone.
Yeah.
No, I've just got a slightly different perspective. I mean, I think that the data that we will get out of the Alliance now will prove to the government that centralisation of sarcoma care produces better outcomes, and that's because there's standardisation and that's across public and private. And for those whoops operations, as we call them, and various other things that are done in different parts of the state, and that centralisation of care, we already provide decentralised services, but that centralisation of care will be important. That's actually not what's going to make an impact. That's part of it. The second part of it is that by centralising that care, that's where the hard decision gets made, and that's where the consumer gets empowered to say, well, if actually you're going to improve the outcome, you need to go to that service because you're going to have a better outcome than you did before. But what in sarcoma treatment has largely been static for 30 years. So outcomes haven't improved that much. But with the NIBs and MABs and various new treatments coming along, that ability to access trials and have positive outcomes from trials and get that data early, that's quite powerful. But then there's another part, and John just brought it up with Rare Cancers of Australia, and that is that if you take a rare cancer drug to the TGA, they will want to examine that using conventional statistical techniques to prove that they should fund that under the PBS or it should be approved. But in fact, they need to probably, as Rare Cancer Australia is putting it, reevaluate that technique and maybe even move to this, it's a very sophisticated word for an orthopaedic surgeon, but Bayesian technique to look at it when you get early results that are very effective, that you actually approve things to move quickly. And that is the continuum as I see it in terms of the value of the whole project. One, we'll look at the history of Queensland and we'll say, actually, there should have been centralised and standardised care, and that's what we should do in the future. And by that centralisation, we allow those patients the opportunity to get involved in, very progressive and new treatment regimes. And out of that takes us into the next stage, working with the consumer in Rare Cancer Australia.
Right. Shoni, did you and David, did you want to make a comment, Shoni? I mean, you work for a non-profit organisation that's very closely linked to consumers. I've got, maybe you can't answer this, but how do you package big data, not just for clinicians to improve their quality, but how do you package it to have political influence, I guess?
It's a really, really difficult question. I think the first thing that I would say is that we generally...
The question's easy to answer.
Very good. I think that we all underestimate very much the community, and I think that just educating the community about about cancer in terms of how it is across the population. I don't think people actually understand the amount of variation in outcome that we have in the population. And Sandro, you asked me before how are these data used, and I would say the best way of using these data is to illustrate where there is variation. If we could all have the result from cancer and the treatment pathways that the best groups in our society do, we would instantly reduce cancer mortality dramatically. And I don't think people really understand that. So I would say the first thing is to really begin to educate the population about these data for Queensland. How you do that? Well, we're about to start a research project to look precisely at that, and if anybody has any funding they would like to give us for that project, it'll be very welcome. It's a difficult thing to do, but there are so many opportunities now for getting information out there digitally. Techniques are coming on board all the time, and I think that we really need to educate the community, not just having consumer groups, although that's important, but to really have people choose where they go, as Peter has just said. If people understand where results are better and where outcomes are better, they will want to go there for their treatment, and that's where it needs to be driven. That wasn't the answer, but that was what I wanted to comment.
I think the point I was going to make has already been expressed by Joanne and Peter. Basically, it is that big data is the thing that will cast light on two diverging things. Is it better to centralise this, or is it better to disperse it out there? And they're different solutions for different diseases at different times. They've got to be continually assessed. So big data provides the answers for that.
So, we heard about the outcomes with lung cancer and that, but you're not going to get a PBS approval on big data. So that's a problem in the sense that the PBS, I don't have to take that, nor will the whoever the advisory group. But the problem is when those trials are used for data to change practice, when it enters the real world, you sometimes observe something different, and I think that's where big data can help us as well. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical to our surgeons. So Lindy and Peter, I'll include David in that. You've just received some data from KitKat, Cancer Line, saying that your unit doesn't really, compared to the rest of Queensland, is underperforming in terms of mortality, high mortality or something. How would you respond to big data such as that? Is your immediate instinct to say, well, we do much more difficult cases and that's why our data doesn't work so well?
Absolutely, and my patients are older and sicker and they've got more comorbidities.
But we've controlled for all of those things.
Then, can you tell me who's doing it best? Because then I'd like to go and talk to them and see what they're doing differently to what I'm doing. Yeah. And I've actually had this, I've contributed, not cancer, but my temporal lobectomy data to an international consortium, and it's come back that my quadrantanopia rate is 17% and it ought to be 5%. So I need to put to that consortium exactly those questions. Are you really measuring it the same way as I'm measuring it? And if it's not, how are they getting it better than me, because I want to be doing it like that?
Peter?
Yeah, I think the paternalistic angry response is history. I think that in an insightful, sensible, clinical way, we would call for the information and examine it and look for the holes in it to start with, because there'll be some. and then beyond that, we would
paternalistic and angry.
Yeah, we might get paternalistic. Yeah, but we would, ultimately then, look for the gold standard and progress towards that and look for the key factors to improve outcomes.
Penny, up until recently, has been working in a regional centre, and she really likes treating sarcomas. And
Peter's referred me a few patients, FYI.
it's a and so she's saying, well, why is it that if the data's not so good, why should we send them to Brisbane? Shouldn't we just be elevating our surgical standards? So, Penny, in the regional centre, do you see, QCAT does produce outcomes in rural and regional. Is there any way of utilising that data sort of to maximise its influence practice in the regional centres, or should you just give everything up to the metropolitan people?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Sandro. I guess there's, very general view that potentially cancer outcomes may not be as good in rural and regional areas. I'm very fortunate to be a part of two fabulous MDTs, head and neck MDT and breast MDT, and I think our outcomes are probably like the best in Queensland. So I sort of consider that we're part of a, in a regional, area, nearly I'd say metro, and so lucky to work with a fabulous specialist team. But yes, no, we do need to consider, we all want the best outcomes for our patients. In Toowoomba, for disease sites that perhaps we don't treat as frequently, or for special types of radiotherapy that we may not have as much access to, such as stereotactic, we do refer down to Brisbane. So I think it's being aware of what you're able to provide and high quality care, and if that perhaps is not available at your centre, you refer to a Brisbane centre. Saying that, we also get a lot of complex cases that come back from Brisbane, including cases from your previous head and neck MDT in Brisbane, Sandro, at the PA. So I think it's collaboration and working together and providing high quality of care services that you have available, and if that's not available locally, you refer to a larger centre and work together.
Big data does help you benchmark. So would you say that's fair, Shoni? Do you get a lot of pushback in terms of, when reports are generated that, one group may be not performing the same? And what sort of questions do you get?
I'll share a little story. Several years ago, we were dealing with a complex surgical issue. And the particular committee who was actually having to consider what to do in relation to that particular issue, we're having quite a robust discussion about, well, should they get paternalistic amendment or not? And if not, then what? And for a minute there, they were quite stumped because it was like, well, what do we do next? And so the question was put to them, well, how would you like this to be presented to you if you're one of those poorer performing centres? And I said, oh, well, don't come at us with a sledgehammer. We would much prefer to have somebody, pick up the phone and talk to us, and perhaps we could have a chat over a cup of tea and work it out. And I think that approach has actually, paid off huge dividends for us, because ever since, I guess that's the type of approach that we tend to take. So there's far less sticks and far more carrots, like you was alluded to earlier, and we really try and work hard alongside the clinicians who are dealing with those tricky issues to help them understand it. And they have to make some really difficult and challenging decisions. Another particular service that was a more regional rural location really had to think hard about the type of services they could offer there, and it completely changed the way they could look at service across the health sector. So there are difficult decisions for people to make on the basis of this data, but at the end of any of those scenarios, people have always said to us, but geez, I wouldn't have known this. I would not have been in the position to know this had I not had this information. So they're usually great.
In deciding the treatment, it's always shared decision making with the patient, and we're assuming that the patient always wants the best treatment, but sometimes they might be content with a local treatment. And I had a friend of the family who wanted to have their low colorectal cancer operated on by their local general surgeon, and I was able to show them the exact difference in the 5-year survival if they had it done by the local general surgeon versus a specialist colorectal surgeon in the city. And they said, yeah, thanks very much, that percentage, it does not outweigh the value of me having it in my own community when they have it at home. And that they're doing fine. But the data helped weight that decision for them about how important it was or not to go to the city.
Yeah, I just have a comment, because I still got the opportunity to answer that question, Sandro, about Toowoomba. A couple of things. One is...
Focus is on big data.
Yeah, I understand that. No, but there's a couple of things about that, and again, it comes back to what I was talking about with, I guess, centralisation of services. Not all cancers are the same, and in sarcoma, we're talking about rare cancer. And I think that the other thing is Queensland's a big state, and it's great that, as you know, when you were in practice with me, that the patients would come and stay in Brisbane for 6 weeks, and that was awful for them. So the fact that we've seen a decentralisation of that adjuvant therapy, neoadjuvant therapy, has been really powerful and socially, much better for them in terms of consumerism. But if you then put the pressure upon a surgeon in a sort of small isolated community to do an operation once a year, that equates to it becoming an OOPS operation, which means that, the surgical skill and standard that keeps getting repeated in the central centre is still much more powerful in terms of reducing the outcome. And the other thing is, there's one last thing, and that is to do with a body of interest. So, as Penny was talking about head and neck and breast in Toowoomba, once you've got a group of clinicians who are prepared to work together, who are prepared to look at other standards and make sure that that standard's the same, that's very powerful, but you can't from one clinician, but you can expect that with good support.
Thank you. So I want to ask two more questions. One is, we've got all this big data. How is Queensland doing? How are we doing in the cancer space? Are we able to benchmark that? Do we have, how do we compare when we benchmark to Australian standards?
We can only compare our data now with theirs from 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, fair enough. Does anyone have any comments? Yeah.
Just a quick question, I guess it's a bit controversial. If you're looking at the KPIs, you use that controversial thing called optimal care pathway and timing of it. Would you, with the power of big data, you could publish and say, well, this is how each hospital, passes or fails according to OCP. I guess, how would you use that, or how does you practically see patients and consumers using that, saying, oh, I'm never going to go to these regional hospitals from now on, and that would overload all the metro hospitals who presumably have performed better with OCP, or in the private sector, let's say. But does anyone have any solutions for those types of issues that would come up with if we publish these timelines that are taking around?
It's a great question.
I wish I had an answer to that, Brian, really, because that's been the issue. Remembering North America has published things like that for surgical rates, and there was, which they didn't count for cofactors like complexity and comorbidities in the way it was presented. So you have to make sure that's done. But I suspect you may find that it's not all going to be metro. Some of those are not going to do as well as others. I think we need to be honest, it needs to be out there in some way. But how do you then have the rational conversation, which is the hard part, so that you don't have people making the decision for the wrong reasons? And it's still better to try and see if you can get your care closer to home, because it has so much advantages. So I'm not certain how to do with that. That's the conversation we've got to have, and I'm still struggling to know where to go. John?
I guess the other way I look at it, John, is to improve all those teams to the standard, which is what all the clinicians want, and of course all the patients want too. So everyone has the same motivation to get the best possible.
Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the rule. It's really about. It's more about how we use the big data to provide equity.
We've used it to show that in brain cancer there is no difference between the rural and the city outcomes.
I think, my comment is big data should be big data, and, you want to get broad themes. There are big themes that have come out of all of this work, and it's the broad themes that really are important. Are certain groups disadvantaged? Are certain methods of practice less advantageous than others? And that then brings, rather than an institution by institution competition or surgeon versus surgeon competition, it brings a system versus system. How do we improve system? And generally, most people want to improve the work that they do. So if you can show those broad themes, then you bring people along with you. But I think Euan's approach, not the big stick approach, has been really essential in this.
The thing that probably would win is if you just run things around MDTs, because the power of having multiple clinicians making the decisions so you have the right decisions, which also can influence where it happens, is often the best thing. and how we can empower that properly, both publicly and privately, would be the ideal.
I've been involved in also the blood cancer national action plan over the last 3 or 4 years. And, one of the big things that comes out is not the desire, even for relatively less common diseases, to bring them to town. It's to talk about them in town, perhaps, or allow physicians out on the edges of towns, because the edges of cities are often as difficult as the rural areas. The ability to talk about cases and to communicate and break down some of the traditional barriers to communication is really very important. And the whole COVID experience has taught us a lot about remote care. But there is it came out consistently in that plan as the message that people want to be able to be treated in their hometown, but their clinicians talk to the people in the big centres.
So one more question.
It was more a comment, I think, just related to Brian's last question around, monitoring adherence to things like optimal care pathways, and you publish that data and what the consumers do with it, or clinicians. And I think that's one of the things we really try to consider in our presentation of results like that, is to avoid presenting things in a way that implies ranking or things like league tables, or this is better than that. What we're really interested in is the unwarranted variation that requires investigation, and that's the approach we're taking rather than trying to direct people and point out centres of excellence or whatever. It's making sure that the care is.
It goes back to Joe's comment about saying, the most important thing that we can do is if we implemented ideal care, we would fix most of the inequities. And, that should be our aim, because globally we do very well. And it's just that some groups don't, and we've got to fix them.
So really with that big data to the clinicians here, the thing is really, when you've got big data, the challenge is to mould a story. And that's really where the trick is. You've got all this amount of data, and moulding the story is the challenge. I'm going to finish here. We've got a minute. Shoni, I want you to have the last word. Could you tell us, maybe you can't, but you've been linking all this data from lots of sites. What do you forecast in the next 5 or 10 years? How are you going? How are the partnerships going to collect data? Will you see a change in the way you collect data? We're going to have all the clinicians walking around with red cap. How are we going to do it?
Well, we hope that doesn't happen. I think we will see significant changes, and if we think about the rapid evolution in the way that big data is being handled, just even since the partnership has existed in the last 20 years, the next 20 years we're only going to see that take off like a rocket. So I think we have to be smarter with the data that we do use. I think we have to employ better technologies. The world has changed. When we first started, we didn't know what a data scientist was. Now, we're really keen to have them on the team, because they're the people who can do fancy things with getting data out there, sharing it, processing it, extracting it of text, etc. The other thing I would say, though, about the partnership and this whole program of work is that we shouldn't overlook is the constancy of this group. So this is, I think, a very different scenario to elsewhere in the country. Cancer Alliance Queensland has been around for 20 years, and it intends to stay around for the future. And that's not the usual case with this kind of thing, even with big data. People tend to dip in and out with research projects. They do the project, the effect data gets dumped, and off they go on to the next thing. Cancer Alliance has stayed around and will continue to work with the clinicians across Queensland, both in the public and the private sector, and that's represented today with everybody. And I don't think we should underestimate the value in that. It's an ongoing process where we're working together so that every Queenslander gets a chance to receive that optimal care.
Excellent, Shoni. And I have to say, from a clinician's point of view, the Alliance has really broken down a lot of fears that clinicians carry about what's going to be exposed. And I think that continuity and just the steadfast and word about quality and about the patient has really resonated. I'm going to end there, so I'd like